Good morning, everyone. I am out here at property that is neighboring to mine that a kind neighbor is letting me explore today because they have a really cool spot, a little bit of a cove in some hills where there's a lot of drainage and a lot of moisture accumulating. So it's a little bit of a protected area, very shaded in the woods. Because of that, it is loaded with ferns. If you can see behind me, there's a lot of greenery. And my neighbor let me know that she actually calls this spot Fern Gully, which I think is very appropriate. And I happen to be sitting right now in a spot that is that I would call a gully through this area. It's pretty neat, very dense with ferns, so it's very green. A little bit of info about ferns. They're quite different than most of the plants that we think of because they are an entirely separate group of plants. They are non-flowering, and they're actually one of the oldest groups of plants. They believe that they have been around for a very, very long time, much longer than our flowering species. So that's what helps to make them really cool. That's why we think of them as being prehistoric, or what we think of when we think of the dinosaur times. Ferns are very different also in their structures, their reproduction, and the terminology that we use for them, so it can get kind of complicated. In fact, I even think that their scientific names are much more difficult to pronounce in Latin than any other flowering plant. I'm not sure why that is. But so to go over just a few different things about how we talk about ferns, I'm going to use this one here behind me. This is actually a Christmas fern that I showed you previously. So this whole leaf that I am holding here is what we refer to as a frond, whereas on, say, a tree or an herbaceous flowering plant, we would call that a leaf. This whole thing is called a frond. And then running down the center of it is what we call the rachis, R-A-C-H-I-S, and that's just that central stem. That stem can vary in color from fern species to fern species. This one happens to be entirely green. And then coming off the rachis, any little leaves, which again in a flowering plant we would probably refer to these as leaflets. Any small leaves though we call pinnae, P-I-N-N-A-E. So these are the pinnae. And a leaf was further divided and it had more leaflets coming off the side here, we would then call those pinnules. It's one of the reasons that it makes fern identification pretty frustrating for folks. If you don't know the terminology and you're looking at a key, it's quite a bit different than our flowering plants. But they're really cool. They don't reproduce by flowering. I might have to hold this to my pant leg. So you can see on the underside of this fern, most ferns reproduce by spores on the undersides of their leaves. The spores are usually organized into these little circles that are called sori. I'm not sure if I can zoom in well enough on that for you. If not, I'll show you more later. But those spores you can think of as seeds that get sent out, and that's how new ferns are formed. Most ferns are generally clonal. As you can see here, we got big clumps of ferns by each other. That's because they are almost all rhizomatous. So they have rhizomes that run underground, usually pretty shallowly, and then they get these big groups forming. So they reproduce by spores, but also by sending out rhizomes underground. So I'm going to take you through, I think I have 6 fern species at this location to show you. So let's get started. So the first species that we're going to take a look at is the Christmas fern. I had previously shown you this one, but we're a lot further along, almost 2 months along in the growing season. So it's getting to the point where it's starting to put on spores, which really kind of changes the look of it. But as a reminder, Christmas fern is an evergreen fern, so it stays pretty green in the winter. although it does get a little bit of this like dried out, brittle appearance to it. It's usually a pretty dark green color. Its Latin name is Polystichum acrostichoides. It's a difficult one to remember, but Christmas fern, the common name, is easy to remember because if we look at these pinnae, or the little leaflets, if you turn them to the side, they look a bit like a Christmas stocking. I've also heard that because they stay green in the winter time, they're often collected at Christmas for decoration. So there's kind of a double whammy of why people might be calling it Christmas fern. A key identifying feature for these is that little notch in the leaflet, but also what appears to be this really hairy stem, and you can see that it continues, it gets much more as you get towards the base of the plant. That's actually referred to as being scaly. It's not true hairs, but it does look a lot like hair. Really dense on this Christmas fern species. It becomes less as you travel up the stem, but if you look to the base, you can see there is quite a bit of that. And now, since we're well into May, the further you travel up this fern frond, you'll see that the pinnae, or leaflets, take a dramatic turn from these nice boot-shaped, stocking-shaped pinnae. These really, really thin guys. They almost look like maybe they're the new leaves, but in fact, they're not. So we would call these the sterile pinnae, and then now we're moving into the fertile ones. So these are the ones whose whole purpose is to produce spores, which is how the plant is going to reproduce. Like I said already, most ferns produce spores on the undersides of their leaves. And I think I can focus in pretty well for you. Those little circles are called sori. A way to identify some ferns is how the sori are arranged on the leaves or the pinnae. And so these are just in rows of 2 along the leaf. Right now they're white, but they'll darken to probably like an amber brown color, and that's when the spores will actually be fully developed and then released. All spores are transported by wind and water. So that's how they travel, not by, use of, say, like a bird where a berry is transported by. So these are just wind and water will move these. And you can see they continue all the way up the plant. So they're pretty cool. So that's Christmas fern. I won't spend much time on that since we already talked about this species. It is quite large. It could probably get, 2.5, maybe even 3 feet in the right spot. And I'm in an area where there's quite a bit of it. So it looks a little bit like a jungle of ferns right now. I'm going to move right next to this and show you another one that I very briefly touched on while I was at Stemler Cave Woods. This one here is fragile fern, which is Cystopteris fragilis. It's a very small fern. It probably only gets to be the length of the fronds, probably only 6 inches or so, 6 to 8 inches. It's a very frilly, kind of lacy looking leaf. It's a very pale green color. If we compare it to the Christmas fern, you can see that the fragile fern is a very pale green. This is the one that acts a bit as a ground cover. You can get areas, I don't have any right here, but you can get areas that are just kind of blanketed in this. Again, it'll reproduce rhizomatously, so you get quite a carpet of it. It's really, really pretty. It always stays low to the ground and has this very lacy look to it. And these ones are just starting to put some spores on. Actually, I have this one that's a little further along here. On the undersides of the leaves, you can see that there's spores, and the sori are not in rows like they were with the Christmas fern. These ones are arranged at each of those scallops. Looks quite a bit different. Maybe looks a little bit less organized than the Christmas fern does. But again, those are the sori just starting to develop spores. So they're very pale green color, or maybe even white right now. And they'll eventually darken and then release the spores. Both of these, Christmas fern and fragile fern, are incredibly common ferns. You could probably find in every county in Illinois and Missouri. But they're both a treat. They both look really nice. Now I'm going to move over just a very short ways. I don't have to travel very far here because there are so many ferns. To some really cool ones that we see less commonly. So this one here, that's a very pale green color, is called Northern Maidenhair Fern. Its Latin name is Adiantum petiolatum. And there are certain parts of both Missouri and Illinois where you find this commonly. I would say you need higher quality woods for it. Where Christmas fern will hang out in a degraded, and I just noticed this wild ginseng plant right next to my fern, so that's always really excited. I'm sure my neighbor will be happy to hear about that. But where you'll find Christmas fern in very degraded sites, you will not find Northern Maidenhair Fern. It needs really high quality. It does like the really moist areas, which is typical for most ferns, but I'd say that this species can be a little bit more sensitive to any site degradation or lack of moisture. So maybe if there's openings in the trees, it will not do as well. Just cleaning this up, it has a bunch of the oak flowers on it and spider webs. And I'm brushing away so that we can take a better look. So this one is just, it's absolutely gorgeous. When you think of ferns that you want to see in the forest, this should be the top of your list. I don't know if you can see well down here, but there's all these very thin black stems coming out of the ground, rising roughly a foot out of the ground. They have no leaves on them. This is a different plant here. They have no leaves on them until they get to the very top. And then at the top, it branches out with all of the fronds. So each one of these, right where my thumb is going, that's going to be a frond of the Maidenhair Fern plant. And then each of these individual small leaflets are what, again, we call pinnae. What's really striking about this plant is it has a deep black colored rachis or stem. And actually this one almost looks blue towards the base. It might just be, I don't know, I mean, it really looks like it's blue. So it has this remarkable color to it that really stands out, the light green against the black. I know it's probably hard to see in the camera because of the soil in the background, but it's quite striking. Each of the pinnae, zoom in on those, each of the pinnae kind of have a cool shape to them. They almost at times remind me of ginkgo tree leaves, if you're familiar with ginkgo trees. It's almost like one of those leaves cut in half. It's very smooth on one side, and then the other side, I guess you would call it to be like serrated or scalloped, but they just look fringed. Again, adding to their uniqueness, the smoothness on one side and then that fringe on the other side. These I cannot remember right now. I don't see any spores on these ones. I believe that they do produce spores on the back side of their leaves. Some ferns will produce spores on a separate stem. So these would be called maybe the sterile fronds. They don't do any reproduction, and then you'd send up a separate stem. I think it's a little bit early in the season for them, and I don't see any spores to trigger my memory there. But this is Maidenhair Fern, definitely one you want to check out. So special. Usually you find it in drainage areas in the woods. So look along creek banks, gully banks, things like that, where there's nice, good shade. As you can see, I mentioned that they're only in high quality forests. The ginseng, wild ginseng next to it really confirms that. You only get that in high quality areas. So definitely take to places like nature preserves, things like that that have that kind of special designation as being higher quality, and you might come across it. All right, we are coming out of Fern Gully. Gonna walk by some more Maidenhair Ferns. some fragile ferns, some Christmas ferns. And we're going to head over where there is another fern species that I will treat you to. This one here is a very pale green color, you can see. It has these pretty large pinnae, wider than my thumb. I'd say maybe 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches wide, and a good, 4 to maybe 6 inches long. This one here is known as sensitive fern. Its Latin name is Anaclea sensibilis. So we had fragile fern, if you remember. Unfortunately, there's none around for me to show you right now, but we had fragile fern. This one's sensitive fern. Y'all apparently have very touchy-feely personalities. But so we can see that the fronds come out of the ground. They have pretty, they almost feel like a woody stem. I don't believe that it is. These are deciduous ferns, so they go away every year. They don't hang out all year like the Christmas fern does. But the frond comes out of the ground, kind of a pinkish color at the base, turning more of a, just a leaf color. And then you head up to where the pinnae are coming off of the stalk or the rachis. What's cool about these is we would say that rachis is winged. So as the pinnae come and meet the rachis, there is that pinnae or leaf material still. You can see it probably better on the back side. So it has leaf material on either side of the rachis. You'd call that winged. So that's an identifying feature to it. And also that the pinnae are directly across from each other, so they're opposite pretty much. There's another species called netted chain fern that looks, it can pretty easily be confused with this, especially in passing. I've done it, I'm sure, many a time. So you definitely want to look for those opposite pinnae, that winged rachis. These fronds are actually quite large. They're bigger than my hand. So I'd say they can probably get 8 to 10 inches wide, maybe 10 inches or so long. This is, again, the sterile frond. So this doesn't develop any spores on the back side of their leaves. They're just there basically to photosynthesize. And here we have an entirely separate frond coming up. So this is, the sterile frond's probably been up for a month or two even. And this one, the fertile frond's just starting to come up later in the season. And you can see already it's not going to be quite the same size or shape, and it's kind of weird and withered looking. But the whole purpose of this one is producing the spores. Again, on the back side of the leaves. Oh, these ones are just so tiny right now. You can't even hardly see them. But this is the fertile frond, and it'll be much, much smaller. Maybe only a few inches long at most, 3 or 4 inches long. And that's where the spores will be reproduced on this species. Okay, I have a fern species here that you can think of kind of as a loner fern species. It's usually not clonal or rhizomatous, so you often just see them by themselves. This here is a rattlesnake fern. Its Latin name is Botulinum virginianum. It is pretty common. I think we can find it all throughout Illinois and Missouri, but it's usually only in oak hickory woods. So if you have more degraded woods that are, say, dominated by elms, you may not come across it. It's coming up from a single stem that's quite stout. I don't know. Oh, there's a hidden poison ivy down there. That's quite stout, and it's pinkish color to it. And then it comes up and we have this big leaflet here. So all these leaves that are kind of flat is one compound leaf. And then we have the rachis coming from those. And then this one sticking straight up the center is the fertile frond. So the kind of flattish one is the sterile, and then this is the fertile frond, which is where the spores are being produced, not on the back sides of leaves, but really the whole thing itself is just spores. There's these little bulbits along stems. Right now they're green. They will turn a much darker brown color, but they almost look like beads or jewels. So I think it has maybe beaded fern is another less used common name for it. They really do look like beads. I don't know why it's called rattlesnake fern though. That's its most known name. It has quite a frilly leaf that looks a bit like the fragile fern, which I actually happen to have one here, so I can hold them up next to each other. They look quite a bit alike, but you see the fragile fern is only individual fronds coming out of the ground, where this one is just one big stalk coming up and this big compound leaflet. And so they end up, I mean, when you see them side by side, you start to be able to tell them apart. So you have the rattlesnake fern on the right, the fragile fern on the left there. So this is a cool one. It's common, but like I said, it doesn't form big colonies. So you have to spot the individuals, which can be kind of tricky. And there's a few different types of grape ferns actually, which this is one of the grape ferns, I believe. But this is a large one. It's probably 8 to 10 inches wide and 8 to 10 inches tall. So it's like a, roughly size of a piece of paper that's forming this kind of umbrella, this flat umbrella. So that one is rattlesnake fern. Alright, and here I have my final fern to show you. This is a very pretty, attractive fern. I know it's broad beech fern. Has one of the really complicated Latin names that I don't like. This one's Phagopteris hexagonpatura. And I even had to write that one down because I find it so difficult to remember and say. But it is quite a nice medium green color. Here's a piece of a Christmas fern next to it. And they're pretty similar in color. A great way to identify this one, first of all, is that it has the nice triangular shaped leaves. See, you got these 2 points here, and then it tapers down to a point at this end, so it has that really nice broad triangle shape. It is roughly as long as it is wide, very roughly so. I would say in the 8 to 10 inch range both ways. This one is a compound leaf. It's actually doubly compound. And something that's great to identify it by, which is similar to the sensitive fern that I showed, is that it has a winged stem or a winged rachis. That center rib running down the plant actually has that leaf material on either side, all the way down, and when we get down to here as well. And then you come to the actual, the stem part, and that's not winged, that's still just a round stem. But that winged rachis really helps to identify this as a beech fern, broad beech fern. These are perennials. They're clump forming, so you could see this one here is in a nice clump. So they spread underground via rhizomes. These ones are currently are the sterile leaves. I see another frond coming up here, and I'm not sure if that actually belongs to this plant, is a different fern growing up, or is a fertile frond coming on. But I know that the spores are produced in the sori that would be located on each of the lobes on the undersides of the leaves, and there's none on this one. So I think this is a sterile frond, and this is probably a fertile one coming up. On the underside, we can see it is lightly hairy or scaly, as we call it on ferns, and this one's real obvious to tell that winged rachis or winged stem. The underside is about the same leaf color as the top, so no real difference there. These are pretty common in southern and western Illinois. Same for Missouri, southern portion of the state. As you get north in either state, you really won't be finding these. So this is broad beech fern. All right, thanks for coming out for this fern hike in Fern Gully, as my neighbor calls it, and it really has proven to be, we saw 6 different species of ferns, which is actually quite a lot. You need some really high quality woods in order to come across that many, and there's probably some I didn't even notice or didn't cross paths with, so there's probably more out here. Ferns are cool, non-flowering species. They reproduce by spores, makes them really unique, but also makes it so that they can be a little bit difficult to identify. The best way to practice it and to get to know your ferns is to go out in the woods, find 2 ferns or more in the same area, and do side-by-side comparisons, and that'll really help you to learn them over time. Thanks for coming out on this hike. See you later.